Thank you for joining us, and thank you to RightsCon for making this possible, making this extraordinary panel possible. My name is Jessalyn Radek, and I'm the Executive Director of the Whistleblower and Source Protection Program at Expose Facts. And we facilitate investigative journalism in the public interest by providing pro bono direct legal representation to whistleblowers and media sources with a focus on human rights and civil liberties. Basically, there is a spectrum of retaliation that whistleblowers often go through, and it used to historically entail bad performance reviews or unwarranted discipline, maybe a demotion or a transfer that's retaliatory, or administrative leave, or in the worst case scenario, getting fired. But unfortunately, in recent years, this has escalated to putting sources in jail, and not only imprisoning them, but doing so under the Espionage Act, which is one of the most serious charges you can level against an American. So thankfully, two of the people who experienced that Kafkaesque nightmare are with us today. And I want to move on to them so they can share their wisdom about this. And I was going to start by asking, what was unique, John and Jeffrey, what was unique about being in prison for a crime of allegedly disclosing truthful information?
Jeffrey, do you mind if I start with that?
Oh, please go right ahead.
Thank you. You know, Jess, I remember reading on the Federal Bureau of Prisons website once that national security crimes, people convicted of national security crimes, account for something like 0.2% of the US federal prison population. So right off the bat, that sets us apart. We tend to be highly educated. Jeffrey's an attorney. We tend to be older than most of the rest of the prison population. We spend our lives as white-collar professionals, and we somehow find ourselves in prison with pedophiles and drug kingpins and murderers, and really the worst of the American population that's just not able to live in civilized society. I think Jeffrey would agree with this. I think that when you first arrive in prison, you're shocked and in a state of shock because you just simply don't belong there. At least that's how I felt.
Yeah, for me, prison was a waking nightmare. Being African-American in this country and growing up, the one fear I had, because I saw it so much in our society of blacks and black men being thrown in prison. And for me, I tried to model myself, and I was dedicated and knew I was not going to end up in prison. You know, that was a theme for my life. And when that door closed behind me, that clank of those iron bars locking me in, that was the beginning of my waking nightmare. You know, I was just trying to serve my country. I was just trying to be myself and serve my country. And for doing that, I was thrown in prison. And for me, it was just a surreal experience throughout. Not that I felt myself better than the individuals that I was imprisoned with, but you know, I was living the one nightmare I wanted to and strive to avoid. And it didn't make any sense to me that serving my country landed me in prison.
I'm wondering if you felt like, both of you, if you felt like you were treated differently by the Bureau of Prisons and or by other inmates.
I'll go first if you don't mind, John. For me, it was a unique experience. I think, as John had touched on before, it was something that prisons and inmates and staff weren't used to. There was a bit of hands off with me, if you will, but also at the same time, I think individuals saw me as someone who maybe positioned myself as being better than them. You want to challenge the big dog. I wasn't trying to posture myself as any sort of menace within the prison. But the stigma, the view, the image of a CIA officer being in prison, individuals are either going to be standoffish or they want to challenge you. And I experienced both. On the staff side, I think is just a continual marching orders of, oh, this guy needs to be punished more. We're a Bureau of Prisons. We're going to do what we want. And I face that sort of continual punishment because that's all really prisons are and the criminal justice system is in this country, is just continual punishment, even after being convicted.
Oh, I had exactly the same experience. Jeffrey describes it very well there. Although I didn't know what to expect. I think Jeffrey actually had it a little bit worse than I did because his sentence began after mine did. And so with each consequent national security conviction, it seems that the Bureau of Prisons gets tougher, they get meaner, the sentences get longer, and they feel more emboldened in terms of punishing us, including after your actual prison time is over. When I first arrived in prison, I was supposed to be, at least I thought I was, according to the judge, my sentencing judge, I was supposed to be in a minimum security work camp. Now, there had been a State Department whistleblower who was convicted under the Espionage Act and went to a minimum security camp. Well, when I arrived, I was put in the actual prison, just like Jeffrey was when he arrived. And I was told that because I had a national security conviction, that I was ineligible for a minimum security work camp. I knew that that wasn't true, but they didn't care. And I appealed it through the process within the Bureau of Prisons. It didn't make any difference at all. And so I decided on that very first day that I was going to use the training that the CIA gave me to keep myself safe and to keep myself at the top of the social heap in prison. And so I implemented that training. I made strategic alliances with different groups, and it ended up working out okay. I had more trouble. Let me rephrase that. I had far more trouble with the prison guards and the prison administration than I ever did with any other prisoners. The prisoners respected me.
I think that echoes a lot of what Reality Winner
Yes.
and Daniel Hale experienced, because she was thrown in a local city jail for the beginning of her confinement. And if you think federal prison, as horrible as it is, a state prison in Georgia is far worse. And Daniel Hale, after he pleaded guilty, the judge recommended that he be sent to a prison where he could receive the therapeutic interventions that he needed for his anxiety and depression and PTSD. And instead of doing that, they sent him to a communications management unit. There are 2 in the country, and they were created in the aftermath of 9/11 to house terrorists. And so here they are taking a nonviolent offender who had been charged, he had no criminal history, and they're sticking him in a unit for terrorists. And I think that's to send a message to whistleblowers. And same with the mistreatment of Reality Winner. It was so over the top. I mean, going to jail alone sends a chilling message. But then when you hear about people's conditions of confinement, it's even worse. I'm wondering if you can think of like an anecdote where you felt like you were treated differently.
Yeah, well, for me, I had some health issues in prison. I essentially had a heart attack in prison. And it took the efforts of my wife and the followers that she was able to rally, to my aid to get to prison to just offer me the basic health care. I'm standing at a guard, clutching my chest, profusely sweating, shortness of breath, my chest is pounding. And I go to the infirmary and their response is, well, just drink a little more water. I mean, that's the nature of US prisons. And it took the intervention of a US senator to ask inquiry as to what was going on. Why was this man not receiving health care for them to do their job and do what the law says, prisoners are supposed to receive. And I think with the fact that me being a CIA whistleblower, that just sort of gave more of an attitude to them to say, well, you're having a heart attack, just go drink some more water. You're a smart guy, sort of thing. And I think that's just the one, you get the harshness of a US prison, but coming in, having been accused and convicted of allegedly violating the Espionage Act, well, that adds a whole new layer. And it's an attitudinal layer, I think, and it's all the attitude against you. And it just continues that way through time in prison.
Yeah, I had prison guards whisper "traitor" as I was walking past them from literally my very first day in prison. But then I had prison guards who would very discreetly pull me aside and say, hey, how do I go about applying for a job at the CIA? It was very strange. What they were afraid of really was the exposure that I had to the media outside. That was thanks to you, Jess. Before I went to prison, if you recall, you asked me to send you an email when I finally felt comfortable that I had settled in okay. And I waited about 6 weeks, and I sent you an email. It was quite a long email, or it wasn't even an email. I think it was a letter, actually, that I called a letter from Loretto, because I had such deep respect for Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail that I wanted to humbly model it on that. So I wrote to you, and I didn't even realize that I was exposing wrongdoing within the Bureau of Prisons as I was doing it. And so you sent it around, and it made it to the Huffington Post. And from there, it caught fire and it went everywhere. I ended up having Jake Tapper from CNN drive to the prison to interview me. I gave an interview to NPR over the prison phone. It was in the Atlantic Monthly and The Economist and Time Magazine and Playboy. It just went everywhere. That completely changed the remainder of my prison experience, because all of a sudden I was a threat to the prison administration because I had access to the press. And at the same time, even though that angered them, they were afraid to confront me because they thought I would again go to the press. I ended up filing a Freedom of Information Act request on myself, just out of curiosity to see what they had. And much to my surprise, about 6 weeks later, I got a package back that had about 225 pages in it. Most of it was silliness. It was my medical records and my visitors list and things like that. But there were several pages that were specifically marked at the top and the bottom, FOIA exempt, do not release to inmate. And then one of those was a memo that the warden had sent to all prison staff about 4 days before I arrived at the prison. And in big, bold letters, it said, caution, inmate has access to the media. And that sort of set the tone for the next 23 months that I was there.
Interesting that the media is seen as dangerous, but that's their mortal enemy, that information should actually get out about how people are being treated. And it speaks to the reason why I think they very much wanted to put Daniel Hale in a place where his communications, even with me as his attorney, are limited. It's unreal having this little access to a client and having it be so regularly frustrated with no recourse options, because everything's secretive and it's a terrorism unit. And why would Daniel be in there if he had not done something really super bad. And I'm like, you know what? Murderers, pedophiles, cannibals, people in the supermax have more access to the outside world than a whistleblower who got stuck in a communications management unit. And it's just astounding to me, the ways that they try to use a process of punishment to further punish you. But another thing I was curious about was how you think the mainstream media covered you both before you went to prison and afterwards. And I know, John, you just spoke some about getting the coverage ahead of time, because obviously the government puts out a horrendous press release caricaturing you as like some bad, horrible spy, basically. And then basically it's up to you, and you're fighting with both hands tied behind your back while blindfolded. And so other people have to come up and fight for you who have a microphone, or some semblance of one. And I'm wondering, what was the reception of the media before, and what seemed to be their tone afterwards?
Well, in the very beginning, and when I say beginning, I mean from like the day of my arrest, I was universally referred to as CIA leaker, or accused CIA leaker John Kiriakou. That changed relatively quickly. And for most outlets, really thanks to your intervention with some of the big outlets, I became CIA torture whistleblower John Kiriakou. Now, there was one network in the United States that just never, ever used the word whistleblower when speaking about me. And in fact, their most important, most prominent anchor continually referred to me as John Kiriakou, who styles himself a whistleblower. But other networks like CNN and especially Fox News embraced me. I'm still welcome at Fox News. Now, because my case was a long time ago, that coverage has worn off. But in the mainstream media, I'm almost always referred to as a whistleblower. And in the alternative media, whistleblowing is celebrated, and I'm always welcome there.
I'm wondering what you think about if there's steps the media could take to better protect their sources. Obviously, they've tried to do cosmetic things and some substantive things like using encryption, or trying to walk people like, here's how to blow the whistle, here's some tips and that kind of thing. But I'm wondering if you think there are other steps that they could take, especially in light of the media's casual or lazy and treatment of people like Reality Winner and Daniel Hill, which contributed to their arrest and imprisonment.
Well, if I can jump in, one thing I think the media and journalists should really be cognizant of is that you have someone's, you're dealing with someone's life here. It's not just the story in a vacuum. This person had the bravery to come forward to you to say something. In my case, I wasn't a source. I was accused of being a source. So what I found just incredible is that leading up to my trial, when there was the threat of the journalist being called or hauled into court, and if he hadn't testified, he was going to go to jail. Once that became more of an issue, that was more of an issue for mainstream media. They rallied around themselves. They rallied around themselves to protect one of their own, despite the story, and without any regard to whether I was innocent or guilty. And it became so one-sided in the media that I became a spectator to my own trial. It was no longer the United States versus Jeffrey Sterling. It was the Risen case. He was the journalist in question here. And I think that just showed a disregard for the fact that, here's someone whose life, they took steps to serve their country and the mainstream media showed more interest in their story and protecting their own. I think if you want to be the vehicle for change, the vehicle for information, then you have to understand and you have to take the steps necessary to protect the individuals that you're getting this information from. I mean, if you don't, and now with the expansion of the Espionage Act, that protection is going to extend more around, you're going to need more protection than just, the insular, let's protect all journalists. You're going to have to protect yourself because the Espionage Act could be coming for you as well. So I think journalists, have that in mind, not to the extent of, to stay away from whistleblowers, but to know that, here's someone who's taken a risk to come forward. Then you need to put in the same amount of work that matches the risk that they're undertaking. And I think those should be things that journalists should and must consider.
I think those are excellent points. And you also, this kind of bridges to the fact that Julian Assange, who is a publisher or, is also being sought, for extradition under the Espionage Act. And I had always said that the war on whistleblowers was a backdoor war on journalists, and people scoffed at that. But here we are. And people are trying to dodge that by saying, well, he's not really a journalist. I'm like, but he's being prosecuted for regular journalistic common practices like cultivating a source, using encryption, putting information out there, publishing truthful, factual information. So I feel like, unfortunately, what in the beginning cases, like with Tom Drake, where no one since Dan Ellsberg had really been brought up on Espionage Act charges, that now using the Espionage Act has become, unfortunately, normalized. And
I think one other thing with the Espionage Act, it doesn't matter how you classify yourself as a journalist or whatever. If the government wants to classify you as whatever, with the Espionage Act, as long as they say you have access to information that should not have been out or you mishandled, doesn't matter how you classify yourself. You are open to prosecution under the Espionage Act.
Right. And it's especially unfair because obviously it's a strict liability law. So there are no defenses that you can raise, such as the CIA said it wasn't torturing people, but I had direct evidence that they were. You can't make that argument while you're being prosecuted. You can only make that kind of argument about your good intent at sentencing once you're already found guilty. So it's really just a pernicious law. And, as much as I'm not a Donald Trump fan, I don't think this law should be used against anybody, because it's so fraught and it's been so abused and misused. So I'm wondering if, what you think the message was that your conviction sent to other people in the intelligence community and just federal whistleblowers and any whistleblower at all, because you both had a certain amount of visibility on your cases that other people didn't have.
A New York Times journalist told me that on the day of my arrest, every single one of the New York Times national security sources went silent and stayed silent for at least 6 months. And, somebody inside the CIA mentioned to one of my attorneys once that the point wasn't necessarily to prosecute me. The point was to so frighten everybody else in the intelligence community against reporting on issues that needed to be reported on: waste, fraud, abuse, illegality, etc. That was the point. The point was to silence everybody. And they mostly succeeded, I would venture to say.
I think it definitely created a chilling effect. And even though we've improved ways that you can blow the whistle, the government, the internet and secure drop, all those things have created safer ways and better ways to blow the whistle, but they've also made it easier to get caught. Technology has been a double-sided thing here. Part of me still is like, okay, meet in the underground parking garage because you're not going to leave metadata trails, which, as Jeffrey's case illustrated, because he was tried based on purely circumstantial evidence, that the metadata can look really damning, even when it actually, and it can be framed by the government into a narrative that makes you look guilty, even when you're not. So technology is kind of this double-edged sword. And then you couple that with the normalization of prosecuting people for espionage, when really they're among the most patriotic people I know, who were just trying to protect the country. And they also tellingly revealed some of the worst government abuses that we've seen in the last century, like torture, domestic secret surveillance, war crimes. That's what people, those are the ones where people ended up getting sent to jail. And meanwhile, you have the government leaking every single day. You can't read the New York Times without reading multiple leaks every single day. And that goes for every paper. That's their bread and butter. And unfortunately, I think that line is blurring now that the US is, because Julian Assange is very unpopular right now. That makes a good test case to go after someone who's in the business of publishing information. So it does not bode well for us as a free and open democratic society to be clamping down on the fourth estate. So did former colleagues like keep in touch with you, or were you radioactive? Or did you find a new community, a new tribe of people that you sympathized with? Because you both have been very much on the activist circuit and willing to speak out, much to your credit, after having gone through a living hell.
Yeah, I think for me, radioactive is the proper description. And for me, actually, before I blew the whistle about a faulty Iranian program targeting the Iranian nuclear program, an operation I felt was very dangerous. And I went through proper channels for it. But before that, I had sued the CIA for racial discrimination because, they weren't allowing me to do the work that I was there for, because to them, I stuck out as a big black guy speaking Farsi. So I sued the organization. I sued the CIA. My case was not allowed to go forward because of, surprise, and national security concerns. But during that time, employees, and I sort of got that unwritten message that no one wanted to have or was allowed to have any contact with me. Once I blew the whistle through proper channels with regard to that faulty operation, it was even more so. And it makes it really difficult because, I was in the CIA undercover, no one knew. So that is a community, once you get into the CIA, that embraces you, that is there for you, that it knows the type of life you're living. And then all of a sudden you're kicked out of that community. It's like being thrown into a new world that you're not used to. So that makes you feel even more alone, more isolated. But then through the difficulties, through the ordeals, you do find those individuals, those groups that are supportive of you, and that helps lift you up. And I think that's what I experienced.
Amen. I experienced the same thing. I'm not in touch with anybody at the CIA, not with any of my former colleagues, many of whom I consider to be close friends. They've all walked away from me, but that's okay because I've been embraced by this new community. People like the two of you and other activists and other whistleblowers and proponents of peace and civil rights and civil liberties and human rights. And it's made my life better, richer, fuller. I'll take this life over my previous life any day.
And we're glad to have you on team whistleblower rather than at the CIA, which obviously did not appreciate your or Jeffrey's enormous talents. It's amazing to me looking at Tom Drake, Ed Snowden, Daniel Hale, you guys, reality winner. I have rarely met such talented, thoughtful, intellectual, dedicated people, and that the government was so willing to throw people like that under the bus and continue to employ and promote David Petraeus and other people who also leaked, but leaked in a way that made the government look good. It's just shocking, but all too real. We had one.
If I can interrupt, because you
Mhm.
Mentioned sort of a trigger for me.
Sorry.
While I'm in prison, being convicted on no evidence of violating the Espionage Act, Petraeus was being handed a golden chalice. He did obvious things. There was plenty of evidence. He lied to the FBI. He took national security information, at his whims, maybe for the glorification to his paramour. Yet here I am sitting in prison, and this individual is just walking free. Not even a slap on the wrist, promoted. He's still working within government. Yet because maybe I didn't have the right connections, I didn't have the right skin color, or I didn't piss off the right people. Yet that individual I'm sitting there in prison and he's out there and free. And I think also, if we're going to talk about mainstream media, there really wasn't much discussion about, the differences there. I actually went through a trial. This individual broke every law you could think of with regard to working in the intelligence community, and he was just given a slap on the wrist, maintained his position within the government, and is out living free while I'm behind bars, on no evidence, just trying to serve my country. And I think the press could have done a little better job in exposing, that there's two kind of, what are the difference with the criminal justice system in this country, and especially when it comes to national security. There's one for the privileged system, and then there's a system for individuals like me and John, who the hammer will come down upon.
May I add to that as well?
Yes.
I'm so glad Jeffrey brought this up, because this is a trigger for me too. On the day of my sentencing, David Petraeus was the CIA director and sent an all-hands email. This is an email to every employee of the CIA. And he opened that email by saying, "Today is a great day for the intelligence community. Today is the day that John Kiriakou was sentenced." 2 hours later, in his office, he lied to 2 FBI agents who were investigating him for not just leaking classified information to his adulterous girlfriend, but also for exposing the identities of 10 covert CIA officers. He lied. That's a felony. It's also a felony, the same felony that I was convicted of, a felony to expose the identities of CIA officers. He did it times 10. He also revealed information from the so-called Black Book. That is the highest, the most highly classified document in existence in the American government. He exposed that to his girlfriend. But as Jeffrey rightly points out, he was charged with a misdemeanor, failing to secure classified information. He was sentenced to a year of unsupervised probation. He was allowed to keep his security clearance. And again, as Jeffrey points out, he's still doing classified work for the US government. And at his sentencing, the judge came down from the bench to shake his hand and thank him for his service to the country. So Jeffrey's right. If you're part of the in crowd, you can do anything you want. But if you make waves, if you complain about waste, fraud, abuse, or illegality, or racism, they're going to take you down.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I didn't mean to trigger either one of you. I just wanted to point out that double standard that exists in terms of who gets prosecuted and who doesn't, because there are a number of top-level officials who have leaked classified information, including Leon Panetta to make the movie Zero Dark 30, Petraeus to impress his girlfriend. I mean, not only leaking tippy top secret classified information, but doing it just out of self-aggrandizement, rather than what you guys did, or what Jeffrey's alleged to have done. And even if that were to be taken as truth, all of this would have been done to serve the public interest and the public's right to know about what its government is doing in secrecy. And it just is kind of, the icing on the cake of the day that Jeffrey's case started as a complaint he was filing against the government for their civil rights abuses of him. And it's amazing how much the government will flip the script immediately, but that's what the CIA is good at. I mean, they're trained to do this. Interrogators from the FBI are trained to do this. If people have not seen the new Reality Winner documentary on Max, formerly HBO Max, I recommend that to you. And I know Sonia Kennebeck also has a documentary on Reality in the works, and has covered you, John. I think you're part of that documentary too. And I appreciate both of you speaking out, because especially after what you went through, most whistleblowers, I know after what I went through, a lot of people would just hide under a rock and just want to live the rest of their lives in quiet peace. And you and Tom Drake and Ed Snowden and Chelsea Mannings and Reality Winner, and Daniel, people have spoken out and continue to talk about what happens. In a way, if the government wanted to quash you and shut you up, it kind of created the exact opposite effect. John, you went on to write multiple books about what you experienced that sold very well. Jeffrey, you've written a book. I mean, if the goal was to shut you up, it's a very backwards way that they went about doing it, which actually had the opposite effect, I would argue. I had a question from the audience, which was from Milan Tranca. Is it possible to have a legal framework that guarantees the protection of whistleblowers and the full exercise of human rights, both in and out of the US? It is possible. Whistleblowing, there are some European countries that have it, but a lot of countries don't have the American concept of whistleblowing, or Whistleblower Protection Act, however inadequate it is. It seems to be a very uniquely American thing, even though other countries are starting to try to create lanceur d'alerte in France and other kinds of whistleblowing type measures that are more focused on corruption, rather than just speaking truth to power by one individual. I think the main thing that would need to happen, and there has been legislation recently that has begun to make its way to Congress, that would allow a public interest defense for people who are charged under this law, and or get rid of this law completely. It really should be repealed. This is a law from 1917, before the advent of classified information in 1950. So, I mean, really, this law is ancient. They resurrected this.
If I can step in, I mean,
Sure.
yes, I think there can be a legal framework for protections for whistleblowers and journalists, because there is a framework right now to persecute them.
Yeah.
And it's all with the lawmakers and what you do with the law. We have the Espionage Act here. In the UK, it's the Official Secrets Act. And they all seem to be designed to, shut whistleblowers up, punish and persecute whistleblowers. If that legal framework can be created, the legal framework in the opposite direction can be created. So I think more pressure on politicians and even the judiciary in whatever country. I think just because a government claims national security doesn't mean that it's hands off for judges. I think judges have to have the backbone to stand up to government aggression against the rights of its citizens. And we see that happening more and more with the Espionage Act. And as it's continuing to develop, just like the Espionage Act, the Official Secrets Act, and other countries that are following suit. And it's all in the matter of means of protecting government illegalities and wrongdoing, not to protect the nation. It's to protect the wrongdoers.
I'll add something too. There's an organization, an NGO in Australia called Blueprint for Free Speech. And what they do is they offer legislative framework to any country interested in receiving it that would allow them to customize whistleblower protection legislation and then pass it into law. I've worked with them in a number of countries. Greece actually, we worked very closely with the government of Greece, and Greece did pass a whistleblower protection law based on their on Blueprint for Free Speech's guidelines. And then that law was adopted in part by the European Union. They've also had legislation passed in 14 other countries all over the world, as diverse as the Czech Republic and Zambia and Canada and Papua New Guinea. So it's out there and it's possible to do. It's much, much more difficult here in the United States, as both of you have said, because there's no stomach for it on Capitol Hill. I had a politician, a member of Congress, say to me one time, can you imagine going out on the campaign trail and saying, I want to make it harder to prosecute people for espionage? But that misses the entire point. The point is, most of the people who are charged with espionage or have been convicted of espionage didn't commit espionage. They were whistleblowers. There's no distinction in the law between a whistleblower and somebody violating the Espionage Act, because the Espionage Act keeps getting, or the interpretation of it keeps getting broader and broader and broader, to the point where, as Jeffrey said a moment ago, almost anybody can be charged with espionage. And that's not what the authors of the law meant.
Yeah, we have a very broad definition of national defense information that can include just about everything, touches on national defense information these days. I mean, even arguably like acting up at the airport at TSA. I mean, it really is a kind of remnant of the post 9/11 national security state that has been sprawling and continues just to grow. I was hoping eventually the pendulum after 9/11, to the extremes we went, would swing back to some kind of equipoise, and that hasn't happened. It's just gotten worse in a number of ways. And yes, a huge hat tip to Soulette Dreyfus at Blueprint for Free Speech for, at least in other countries, trying to figure out a model and trying to do better. And Soulette, interestingly, goes all the way back to the days of working with Julian Assange, yes, and people who were originally at the forefront of this and in the trenches on this. I can't say enough amazing things about her. And having helpful legislation, again, there's no appetite for it in the US, even though there have been recent attempts to amend or repeal the Espionage Act. And there have been other attempts to create whistleblower ombudsman, inspectors general, and other things that give you a feel-good notion that there's somewhere safe to go. But unfortunately, in terms of inspectors general, more often end up being a trap rather than a place to actually get redress if you've seen wrongdoing and report it. It's one of the quickest ways to get on the radar screen of the government. Most people, 95% of the people I represent, contrary to what the government says, 95% of them did try to go through proper channels. They did complain internally, and raise concerns. But again, the government rewrites that narrative, and again, revisionist history by these by these agencies, and these are the most powerful agencies in the world. when you look at who's getting prosecuted, you have like Tom Drake from the NSA, Shmai Leibowitz, FBI, Stephen Kim, State Department, Manning, Army, Hitzelberger, Navy, Snowden, NSA and CIA, Sterling CIA, Kiriakou CIA. So it is a cluster of the most powerful and secretive, bastions of power. And the fact that these cases are deliberately brought in the Eastern District of Virginia, the backyard of the CIA, where the judge and the jury are going to either have worked in intelligence or be married to someone who works in intelligence or have a family member there. The forum shopping alone just shows how unfair it is. And then you get the law itself on top of that. It just is a very, very loaded kind of system. And it's a David versus Goliath struggle anytime you're a criminal defendant, but especially when you're under a law that is like, if you disclosed information, it doesn't matter why. It doesn't matter if you had good intentions. It doesn't matter if you were doing it for fame or profit or revenge, or if you were doing it because the president of the United States happened to be lying about the existence of a certain program.
In fact, my judge said very pointedly, Mr. Kiriakou, either you did it or you didn't do it. And I think you did it. And that's really what it came down to. There was no defense. You can't say it was an illegal program, that I was blowing the whistle on illegality. I was blowing the whistle on a program that we prosecuted people for in the past. Either you did it or you didn't do it. It was a simple.
Exactly. And in fact, the people who did torture, in John's case, like on that issue, the people who did torture got essentially blanket immunity from President Obama when he decided to look forward, not backwards, at all that messy stuff that took place. So many people broke the law. And in fact, in these agencies, a lot of other people besides you guys were seeing the same wrongdoing. And most people did not come forward.
Yeah. It all comes down to character assassination, because the government is in control of the dialogue. They determine who a whistleblower is and who is not. And the courts just go along with it. So the government says you're a leaker, not a whistleblower. Well, what is a whistleblower? To the government, there is no such thing as a whistleblower, especially if that individual is blowing a whistle about actions by the government. And the courts fall in line with that dialogue. And I think it's incumbent upon journalists and the press to change that dialogue, not let the government be in control of the dialogue. Because in that case, no one is innocent. If the government says this person did it, this person is guilty, the courts are going to go along with it because, again, under the umbrella of national security.
And I would also mention that people are like, just go to trial and prove your innocence. And I'm like, that's not how it works. If you go to trial.
I did go to trial.
Exactly.
There was no evidence and I was still found guilty. There was evidence that someone else had actually leaked information to that reporter.
Exactly.
Yet I was the one on trial with no evidence. So, Eastern District of Virginia, and unfortunately, I think a lot of courts in this country are just going to bow down to whatever the government wants when it comes to national security.
In Daniel Hale's case, I was one of his attorneys, and they literally decided to close the courtroom, even though it wasn't a discussion of classified information. And so even his own attorney gets shut out. It's unprecedented that this would happen. And then also you're fighting again with restrictions that most defendants don't have. So there's secret evidence that can be used against you under the Classified Information Procedures Act. And so code words that are used to, substitute for common use words like fiber optic. Oh no, we can't say that. It's state secret. we have to use a different word. This is a popular one in a number of clients' cases, motions to preclude the use of the word whistleblower. And that, that's very telling. I mean, but again, you get so many of these motions. I mean, it's already a very lopsided situation in these prosecutions. And then you get these motions to block out reporting, to keep stuff under seal, to keep, not to make certain stuff public, to close the courtroom on certain matters, to not allow certain words, and to not allow any kind of exculpatory. I mean, it's incredible and incredibly tragic and very anti-democratic. So I very much appreciate you guys, sharing your very hard-wrought experiences. I know it's triggering, but I only think it's because of the willingness of people like you and people like Tom Drake and Reality Winner and Hale. I mean, maybe the government should have known you guys are not shrinking violets, but they didn't seem to think about that when they were going after you going after a minnow with a sledgehammer. That you still have your voice, and I commend you for speaking out about that. I know we're coming to the end of the session right now. I'm getting the little warnings, but thank you again, both for doing this and for continuing to fight this thankless battle that we're in, that we often get disparaged for rather than recognized for. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.